Welcome to Against the Odds. I'm Jan Powell, and in this podcast, we'll be meeting guests from all kinds of backgrounds whose lives have been affected in some way by HIV/AIDS. We'll be finding out about the challenges they've faced and what inspires them to strive for what they believe in.
I say this without claiming any credit or glory. I'm still the only person holding public office in the continent of Africa that speaks about my own HIV. That's not a matter of pride. It's a point about how deeply stigma still inhibits people. And the difficult thing to talk about is that this stigma isn't always outside directed.
That was our guest today, Justice Edwin Cameron, who Nelson Mandela once described as one of South Africa's new heroes. His father went to prison when he was just 7 years old, and he spent much of his childhood in a children's home as his mother couldn't afford to take care of him. Despite that tough start, he went on to become a human rights lawyer during the apartheid era and a justice of South Africa's appeal court during his outstanding legal career. Edwin's life changed when he was diagnosed as HIV positive in 1986. His life was saved by antiretroviral drugs, and he was passionate in calling for access to those drugs for millions of Africans who couldn't afford the high cost. He is the first and still only prominent public figure in Africa to declare his HIV status openly, and he's campaigned tirelessly to combat the stigma of AIDS. I spoke to Edwin from his home in Johannesburg, where a rumbling thunderstorm adds to the atmosphere. Hello and welcome, Edwin. Are you well?
I'm extremely well, Jan, and so lovely to be with you on this UNAIDS podcast.
Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. You've had an absolutely outstanding career, but you came from a tough background. You had a difficult childhood, much of which was spent in a children's home in Queenstown. That must have been a really hard start in life.
It was a hard start, Jan, but, I think that the significance of that kind of childhood anguish is how you deal with it as an adult. Do you incorporate it productively and usefully and sensitively to others into your work and into your emotions and your relationships with other people? Or do you let it become some sort of lingering injury or resentment? And I found that the poverty I grew up in, the fractured family, the fact that my father was even in prison for car theft, have all shaped me in ways that have made me see the world, I think, more acutely, more painfully, and I hope more richly.
You were there with your sisters in the home. Did you have a sense of your own family growing up, or were you very isolated?
It was a long way from everywhere. Queenstown is a little town in the Eastern Cape region of South Africa. It was about 1,000 kilometers from where my parents were in Pretoria at that time. And we only got to go home once a year. At the end of the year, the children's home would pay for train fare.
Oh my goodness, once a year. Oof.
So it was a time of a sense of bereavement. And it obviously was accentuated when at the end of that first year in the children's home, our elder sister and the mentor of our three siblings was killed in a traffic collision. So it was a time of mourning and bereavement, but also a time of consolidation. I want to tell you, we have a WhatsApp group of the kids who were in the children's home 60 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And many other kids at the same time in the home have only joyful experiences of that time. So it helps you to contextualize your own sense of grief, your own sense of loss, into something much more positive.
That brings us very swiftly to our theme today, which is against the odds, because despite that tough background, you won a scholarship to a very good state school, Pretoria Boys High School, one of the best state schools in South Africa. So what was it that really kept you going and enabled you to achieve that when so many things, I think, to other people would have seemed to be absolutely against you?
Well, Jan, I did realize that I had advantages as a comparatively clever young kid. And my mum was also very determined that she'd get me into a good school, a good state school. And there were a couple in Pretoria and Johannesburg. There's one in Bloemfontein. So between my own ambition and my mum's determination and a lot of good luck, I got into Pretoria Boys High in my second year of high school. And I had 4 years there, absolutely outstandingly privileged learning environment. And one should say, Jan, that this was the 1960s South Africa when apartheid was at its very height. And on the one hand, the important thing that has shaped my political and activist consciousness is poverty, a sense of class. And then the second thing is of course, race, being white. I got into this fantastically elite school, government funded, government supplied, because I was white. And then I got an even better scholarship to, I hope your podcast listeners can hear the thunder. It's a very rainy day in
I can hear it actually. I can hear the thunder in the background, yes.
I hope our listeners are with us.
Lots of atmosphere.
Yes, lots of atmosphere. Johannesburg is having a very wet summer and the thunder is rumbling outside and wetting our little garden. So, Jan, all white, Pretoria Boys High, all white, Stellenbosch University. And from Stellenbosch, I got yet another scholarship that gave me yet another big break, the Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. And at that time, also all white. So now we have race and class, poverty and whiteness, all in an intense mix inside my emotions. At the onset of adolescence and later.
So you were really aware of that. It wasn't something that you'd just grown up with and become used to. It wasn't something that seemed normalised.
It didn't, Jan. You know, I was deeply ashamed. One of the reasons I talk so much about stigma is that the first kind of stigma I felt was the stigma of poverty. I never told anyone at Pretoria Boys High that I'd been in a children's home. I only started speaking publicly about having been in a children's home when I was invited to speak at the annual meeting of a children's home here in Johannesburg. And I've remained involved with that children's home in the years since then. I decided I'm going to say to this group of kids and parents and donors and volunteers that I'm here because I was in a children's home myself. It was very cathartic. So it was a deep sense of shame of having come from this fractured family, having come from a children's home, when especially Pretoria Boys High was a rather posh school, and almost everyone else in the school came from professional, affluent families. So there was that sense.
Just going back a bit, you mentioned that your father was imprisoned for car theft when you were very young. And you've said afterwards that was really your first contact with the law, with the legal profession. Can you tell me about that and how it influenced perhaps your decision and certainly the directions that your later life took?
Very much so. I think growing up white in the apartheid state, you were very aware of the police, of authority, of power, of the state, keeping black people away, keeping them down, because it was a subordinative system, a system that conferred privilege and opportunity on poor white kids like myself and disbarred the overwhelming majority of South Africa's people from it. So I was very aware of police power and of prisons. And then you realize, but there are complexities to power. There are ways in which power can be used that are beneficent, that open up opportunities to more people, that progressively widen opportunities and facilities to people. So there was that sense that there are different ways in which power can be used, and that the way that the law and police power was being used in apartheid South Africa was deeply wrong.
But it took you a while to consolidate that decision, because you started off studying Latin and classics. which seems like an unusual choice for a young man in 1960s South Africa. And then it took you a while before you changed direction. Why was that?
It did, Jan. I wanted to bury my head in literature and poetry, and I don't disrespect people who do, because we need everything in this world to make it the rich, wonderful place it is. And I still envy those people who chose literary criticism or writing or classics or English literature or Afrikaans literature. I still envy them. But I realized that I myself needed to do something different. And that's why I changed to law after my first term in Oxford. And a second thing happened while I was studying law. In September of my first year of Oxford, just as it was coming to an end, the South African Security Police beat to death a wonderfully promising, magnetic, mercurial young man. He was only in his mid-30s, Stephen Bantu Biko. And this was a shocking event. And then at the end of that year, on an icy Oxford night, I met a young person who'd been elected to come as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, the first Black South African to be elected as a Rhodes Scholar, Loisa Nonga. And that changed my life. The event of Biko's death and just a couple of months later meeting Loisa Nonga brought me to a richer and fuller and more humbler political consciousness.
In your early 30s, you were infected with HIV when you were launching your legal career at a time when there was even more stigma around HIV and AIDS than perhaps there is today. And in 1999, you decided to speak publicly about living with HIV. That must have been an incredibly difficult decision. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was that led to that decision?
I think as a gay man who decides in oppressive circumstances, as apartheid South Africa constituted, to come out as proudly queer. I did that in the year I started my practice as a human rights lawyer in the 1980s. I decided to put the shame that I'd wrestled with for 16 years since adolescence, the shame and self-rejection and grief about the fact that I was queer. I decided to hell with this. I will never apologize again. And then, just a few years later, I become infected with HIV. At that time, the world's most stigmatized disease, and particularly stigmatized to be queer and to have HIV. It was worse than the shock of the death sentence that AIDS pronounced on you in the mid-1980s was the sentence of stigma, of shame, of marginalization. And all of that within a very few years, when I met people so different from me who also experienced the stigma, black women, black spouses of mine workers who did not have the stigma of sexual, quote, promiscuity, a terrible word, of multiple sexual encounters and partners, who said, I've only ever had sexual relations with one man, my husband who's working on the mines. When I started as a trade union lawyer in apartheid South Africa, dealing with AIDS, working on policy, working on cases, I realized that there was something different. This wasn't just orientation-related stigma. This was a deeper stigma that was afflicting the whole epidemic in Africa. So it was a long journey to making a public statement in 1999. And the important part of that journey was when I started on antiretrovirals almost 25 years ago. And it was a momentous realization that the ARVs were working. I knew within 10 or 12 days of starting to take them that they were working. And that gave me the strength and the confidence to put aside the shame also and the stigma of HIV in order to start talking out, not just about being queer, but also about living, surviving with HIV because of access to antiretrovirals.
It must have been a terrifying moment. And I can see it was a process that took years to come to that point where you were prepared to be public about that situation. But I can't imagine what it must have been like to be standing on that podium and speaking to that huge group of people. Were you not afraid that it could, I don't know, have a very detrimental effect on your career, on how people saw you? I mean, you'd lived with that secret for so long. I guess your family knew about it, but to come out so publicly in such a large group, that was another moment when the odds were stacked against you, where maybe this was a decision that you would come to regret. Was that the case?
Very much so. And let us remember that as we sit here talking, it's still a momentous decision for millions of people on the African continent and elsewhere. This difficulty of, I have a viral particle in my blood, which is well contained, well managed, well repressed by ARV medication, but am I going to talk about it to my beloved friends, to my sexual partners, to my family group, to my congregation, to my community, to my workplace? The same stigma still mutes the mouths of so many people. But it was terrifying. It was because I did fear opprobrium, rejection, contempt. I feared criticism. And of course, one must also talk about sex. I had continued. I was a single man, not involved in a committed relationship. And I had sex with people, never anything that ever put anyone at any risk of transmission of my live HIV, but I didn't tell most of my sexual partners that I had HIV. So I had also the fear that people would come forward to shame and denounce me. And none of that happened. None of that happened. I was greeted by a giant, warm, energetic, positive wave of affirmation and acceptance and encouragement from all over Africa. I got messages from all over Africa that people said, you've done the right thing. You're talking about it. You are saying this is about testing. This is about stigma. This is about access to treatment. I've got access to treatment because I've got the salary of a judge. We have to change that. The issues are confronting access to treatment, getting it to the people who need it most throughout the African, Central and Southern African subcontinent, and of course, battling stigma.
So that really did achieve what you'd hoped it would achieve. It affirmed your decision. So the nerves and the worry and the anxiety beforehand, it really were swept away by the affirmation that you received. That's a wonderful story.
It was amazing, Jan. And I did my statement in Cape Town in front of a very public forum, the Judicial Service Commission. I was being interviewed for a judicial promotion after about 5 years as a judge. It was just at the end of the Mandela era. He was just stepping down as president. And I flew back overnight. I saw the main item on all the newscasts that night were the judge with AIDS speaks out. And the next morning I got to my chambers in the Johannesburg High Court, and there were flowers. And there were conservative colleagues popping their heads in and saying, Sterkte ou maat, an Afrikaans senior judge there saying to me, good luck, my friend. So it was that kind. But you're asking something deeper, Jan, and I want to touch on what deeper. You're asking about how one uses your own life and experiences. And I've never said to other people, you have to speak out about being gay or lesbian or transgender or intersex or bisexual. I've never said to people, you should talk about living with AIDS yourself. I have people of prominence in public life, in the judiciary in South Africa, who confide in me. I say very, very carefully, you might find that it'll be beneficial to yourself to start talking about it. It doesn't mean that you've got to get onto a public platform like I did and make an announcement. You can talk to those closest to you. It will benefit them. It might benefit you, your decision. So the question that I think you are touching on, which is a painful and difficult one, is how do you instrumentalize your own life? And when should you do so, if it's ever a should? I decided to instrumentalize my orientation, become a queer campaigner in 1980 South Africa. I felt impelled to it, didn't feel heroic at all. It felt absolutely necessary and quite joyful. And again, when I instrumentalized my own HIV, with the response I got, it also felt very affirming and joyful. In fact, I think one of the best things I've ever done in my life, the most empowering things, was to speak about my own HIV, to speak for treatment access, to speak against stigma, to speak for testing and counseling.
It's interesting, that word instrumentalize. You're using your own life's experience to really put it to the use to achieve what you want to achieve in your advocacy, in your work to promote treatment for HIV, to promote the well-being of people living with HIV, with the LGBTQ community, to really show that it can be done, that you can live a rich and productive life.
A joyful life.
A joyful life, yes, it's a wonderful word.
Can I just say one quick thing, Jan, just quickly in square brackets? We are in South Africa, 13% of us are living with HIV. It's more than 1 in 10 of the population. Almost 6 million of us, like myself, with my morning tea an hour or two ago, take our antiretrovirals every day. When I talk to audiences, whether in the UK or Europe or North America or Australasia or in South Africa, and I start speaking about my own HIV, there is still a hush. There's nothing more potent than saying, I'm here because of access to antiretrovirals, because of privilege. I'm living with this virus. If I stop taking my ARVs, it will resurge. And there's a hush, especially in South African audiences where there's not a single person. I can look at people in the front row and I can say, without being personal to you, I'm not invading your life. I know that you've got this HIV, maybe your parents, your children, or your brother or your sister, or maybe yourself even. And there's the power in speaking not down to people or speaking, sermonizing or lecturing, but saying, this is the grief and this is the path that I walked, and maybe it might have some pertinence to your life and your struggle.
You've come out twice in your life. You had to talk about being gay, and you've also had to talk about later on being HIV positive. Would you mind telling me which was the most difficult decision to take? Or what was it just normal that one led to the other? I mean, one led to the other in the sense that being open about it.
Yeah, you're right to connect them though, and queer people with HIV call it the second closet. You're touching on something very deep about infection with HIV. There is shame about many things in our world. Shame is a very important motive and repressive factor in our world. For example, about race. After 350 years of racial oppression and stigma and marginalization, there's a lot of internalized stigma about race in our country. I can talk about internalized stigma as a queer man and as someone living with HIV. But to say I'm proud, like Steve Biko did, to hell with this white subordination and white prejudice and stupidity, I'm proud to be black. It was a wonderfully liberating, affirmative thing that Steve Biko, very much at the same time as assertive African Americanism was coming out throughout North America. Queerness the same, to say, I'm going to cast off the decades in my life of fear and shame about being queer. It's joyful. Look at all the queer people. Look at all the black people in history who've done wonderful things. It's more difficult with HIV. It's very difficult. How do you say, I'm proud? It's more difficult in Botswana. They did a Miss HIV pageant, which I was very, very touched and thrilled by. To say, yes, I'm proud, I'm beautiful, I'm elegant, I'm composed, I'm intelligent and articulate, and I've got HIV, so what the bloody hell? but it's much more complicated.
You've spoken about how your life was saved by antiretroviral drugs when you developed AIDS. But for many people in South Africa, that was not the case. Can you just give us a little bit of background there about that terrible situation back in the 1980s where millions were dying from untreated AIDS? How did you feel at that point?
Let's link it to our democratic history in South Africa. 1990, Mandela comes out of jail. We start negotiations. We get a democratic constitution. Mandela is inaugurated in May 1994, a joyful moment for our country at the very time that the HIV epidemic is moving from less than 2% prevalence in 1990 to 5% in 1994. By the time Mandela leaves office under Mbeki, at a lot of antenatal sentinel sites and clinics, we're already talking 28, 30, 32%. So it was a moment that clashed with our democratic aspirations and joy, and that was part of the difficulty both for Mandela and Mbeki in dealing with it. And of course, as Mbeki takes power, he is insidiously approached and drawn to AIDS denialism. And the perpetrators of that insidious approach are very proud of it, that they got to President Mbeki at the start of his presidency in 1999, to the horror of Zaki Ahmed, who just the year before founded the Treatment Action Campaign to tackle the drug companies, to shame the drug companies, to say, you dare not refuse to make these life-saving drugs available in Africa. Zaki won, he and his comrades and fellow members won that fight with the drug companies with the help of the Clinton and Gates foundations. There was eventually a big deal done in 2002 to bring down the prices, to provide licenses and manufacturing of the drugs.
Because at that time, the AIDS drugs cost what, $15,000 for a year?
Unaffordably. Patent-enforced price gouging. And a bigger nightmare confronts the Treatment Action Campaign. This highly aspirational, Africa-proud, black intellectual, self-proud black intellectual falls into the trap of AIDS skepticism. It was a catastrophe. And that's when the death figures went through the roof in South Africa. It was a terrible tragedy. And that's why Zaki Ahmed and the Treatment Action Campaign achieved so much. They took to the streets, they took to lobbying, they found social partners very bravely. Mbeki's trade union partners, Kasatu, Zwelinzima Vavi, joined the campaign, and eventually they took him to court. They had to go to court. And because we had a democratic constitution and the rule of law and a Bill of Rights, the court was able to give an historic judgment requiring President Mbeki to start making AIDS drugs available.
During the first couple of years of when he came to power, President Mandela was not very interested in the HIV AIDS issue, was he? He put it to one side a little bit. He didn't face up to it. He didn't deal with it. Do you blame him for that?
I don't, actually. You know, he was a wonderful man. I've never read anything about him that is overstated. And I'm not sentimentalizing him because I've also criticized him. He had 199 things on his agenda when he became president, and somewhere in that mix was HIV and AIDS. We couldn't persuade him. We did everything we could. We wrote to the Secretary General of the ANC. We wrote to the head of his office, both of whom I knew, Cheryl Carolus and Jake Schervel, to ask him to speak out. He eventually speaked out at Davos 3 years into his presidency, February 1997. But let me tell the more important thing about President Mandela. He steps down at the crucial moment of mass crisis of HIV infection, incidence, prevalence, and death and illness in South Africa. And his proud successor, commits government to this calamitously anguishing, tragic, horrific course of AIDS denialism, and Mandela starts speaking out. So heroically, he tells his own family, my son Makgoti has died. We have to talk about it being AIDS. He asks me to come and see him. I sit in his private living room. It's an hour-long chat. He says to me, what can I do? I'm not going to speak out against the ANC and President Mbeki. And I say to him, Mr. President, you can speak out for ARVs. You can speak out about treatment availability. And he does. He goes to Zaki Ahmed. He puts on the I'm HIV positive T-shirt. And he is pivotal. He and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who they are the heroes of wonderfully moral public position taking that eventually, with the court judgment, makes it impossible for the Mbeki government not to make ARVs available.
Well, I think he called you a hero too, Edwin, for your continuing work to promote ARVs and to kind of fight this battle. So it was really his personal connection with the disease, presumably with his son, that kind of really drew him to it and made him realize that he had to do something.
At the end of his presidency and the start of his retirement, and may I just say with regard to your last comment that I was very much in the second or third row. In the front row were Mandela, Ahmed and his activists. I was there as a figure speaking about my own HIV, which had significance, but the activist role, the court cases were done by Zaki Ahmed and his cadre of devoted activists, and that's where Mandela's voice and stature were just unimaginably significant.
You have spent so much of your life advocating and campaigning for different elements of this struggle with HIV and AIDS. At that time, it was another moment when I think the odds were really stacked against success. Did you think at the time that there was a chance of combating the combined forces of Mbeki, his AIDS denial beliefs, the antiretroviral campaigners, the pharmaceutical companies who had absolutely no interest in bringing cheap drugs available to more people? Did you think there was a chance of winning that? Was there a moment when you doubted?
It always seemed doubtful, but nevertheless, the infectious energy of the campaigners, I joined them. And the utter certainty, the humble certainty, not arrogant certainty, the humble certainty that this was a rightful cause, not a righteous cause, because that sounds sanctimonious, but a rightful cause to be embracing ARV access.
It's 40 years now since HIV was really known about, and yet the stigma and shame surrounding the disease seem to continue in so many countries and societies. Are you surprised that it's still such a problem after all these years?
To say I'm surprised would imply that dealing with it is easy, and it's not. I remained largely silent for 14 years, between 1985, at the end of 1986, I got my diagnosis. So it's 12 or 13 years after I knew that I had HIV that I remained silent until April 1999. It's a terribly difficult thing, and I'm very respectful of other people's grappling. I say this without claiming any credit or glory. I'm still the only person holding public office in the continent of Africa that speaks about my own HIV. That's not a matter of pride. It's a point about how deeply stigma still inhibits people. And the difficult thing to talk about is that this stigma isn't always outside directed. There is discrimination. There is discrimination against marginalized groups, prisoners, sex workers, men who have sex with men, people who use drugs. And we know that discrimination and marginalization is a public health catastrophe. It's the worst thing you can do in a public health crisis. But For someone who is not in those groups, the stigma sometimes comes also from within. That's the difficult thing to talk about, internalized stigma, about queerness, about HIV, about racial stigma. It comes from the outside. It is genuinely enacted by hateful people who ostracize you, who humiliate you because you're black or you're queer or you have got HIV. But there's an internal resonance. Now, I think this is a disease that we thought would be more amongst people who have less access to healthcare, a disease of the poor. But the demography of the epidemic in South Africa shows that there are people in cabinet, in parliament, in entertainment, in the soccer field, in leaders in universities, university presidents, who are not talking about the fact that they have HIV themselves, that they are taking ARVs. The point I'm making is that there's also something called internal shame, internalized stigma. But we have to understand that the epidemic of silence about HIV is also an epidemic of internal wrestling and grief and struggle.
Let's move on to something else that I know that you are extremely passionate about and which you've worked on for many years. You've spoken passionately and movingly about the need to decriminalize sex work. Can you tell me why that is so important? Is it to enable sex workers to get access to healthcare and treatment for HIV, or is it more complex than that?
It's all those reasons. But let me say why it's so lovely that you've raised sex work, Jan, because it's connected. Queerness is about your sexual functioning. That's a crude and brutal thing to say, but it is. HIV in 97 per cases is also about sexual functioning. How did I get it? I got it through receptive anal intercourse with another man. Let it be said, I've been saying it for almost 25 years. And it's difficult to say, and people still take in their breaths in audiences when I speak like that. And sex work is about sex. And in all three cases, people are stigmatized. Queer people are stigmatized. In the rest of Africa, there is still enormous oppression, hatred, violence, imprisonment directed at queer people. Sex workers, I'm often asked in public debates and speech, who are the most marginalized and stigmatized people? And you can think of queer people outside South Africa, you can think of cross-border migrants, another highly stigmatized group. The most stigmatized people in the world are female sex workers. A male sex worker can still get away with a lot that a woman or a transgender woman can't get away with. And they are being condemned for sex. It is irrational. It is outrageous. How dare we be telling another human being how to engage with others in privacy, consenting? How dare we? That is my motivation in condemning the laws that stigmatize, marginalize, put at risk sex workers, especially transgender sex workers, especially female sex workers. So it is about access to HIV medications. It is about healthcare. It is about pride. It is about safety. Once we decriminalize HIV, the police can't. The police are amongst the worst perpetrators of violence and abuse against sex workers and exploiting them for using them as sex objects. So it's about all those things, but it goes back to this idea of sexual moralism, which is one of the great evils of our modern society.
So it's about equality as well. It's about giving sex workers equality with everybody else, that they're treated in the same way.
That's right, absolutely. And pride and joy and saying, yes, what the hell? You know, are you... why is there no shame about bankers? Why is there no
I think
shame
there is,
about
actually.
Yes. Why is there no shame about international consultants? We've come out of a dreadful period in our democratic history in South Africa where shameful things were done by bankers and by international consulting houses. Why is there no shame about arms shipments, about Scandinavian arms manufacturers and British arms manufacturers and and Russia and North America? Why are we preoccupied with sexuality and sexual functioning and sexual meetings and sexual interactions? There should be shame about all those other things.
I guess it must be rooted in some sort of religious culture that we've come from. I mean, that surely has to bear a lot of the blame. It goes back into, yes, our background of monotheism and this. Anyway, that's a whole other story, I guess.
But it does have monotheistic roots. And it doesn't mean that all monotheists are sexual moralists. Praise be to the Islamic scholars and the Talmudic scholars and the Christian scholars who are saying it is not for this world to condemn people in a sexually moralistic way. So there's progress on even that.
From the perspective of another pandemic, which is rocking our world at the moment, does the spread of COVID bring back memories of the fear and uncertainty early on in the HIV pandemic?
Very much so. And the same bogus skepticism, the same anti-empirical, loony, rubbish bin, straight-jacketable distortions and misinformation. I'm fighting on a number of platforms now, a school group, my children's home group, about people who are receiving anti-vax lies and nonsense and distortions. So that's the one thing that's very reminiscent of AIDS denialism, and it's like a reprise of anti-scientific, irrational absurdity. And then, of course, the other thing is medical interventions and availability, vaccine hoarding. Now we know this is not only the fault of the wicked drug companies in the wicked North American and Western European countries. It's also the fault of African governments and health administrators who didn't get available doses out to more people. So there are heavy overlays. And the third overlay is the terrible mistake made both on Clapham Common in London by the police and in South Africa, where you use the wrong methods to deal with the public health crisis. You do not use coercion and beating up people and humiliating people and locking them up. You do not use that. You use a positive public health message to get people to change what they do, to choose health-seeking options in their lives. And we made all those mistakes in both AIDS and in COVID.
But are you hopeful for the future, for the progress that's being made? What is it that gives you hope?
To say I'm hopeful is a temperamental thing for me, more than an assessment of the world sometimes, because certainly in the mid-1980s, we seemed certainly destined for racial catastrophe and war in South Africa, and we managed to avert that. During the Zuma years, we seemed destined for destruction of our constitutional democracy by Mr. Zuma and his cohort of looters and criminals and liars. And I think the thing that makes me hopeful is this. There's nothing in this world that we cannot fix with thoughtful, determined human agency. I had a conflict with a colleague last month who wrote something that I thought was very negative, basically saying, we've reached the end of the road for the rule of law in South Africa. I was furious. I said, what would you have said to a German in 1946? Would you have said there's no hope, you shouldn't start rebuilding? What would you have said to a Vietnamese person when that last terrible American helicopter left after all the napalm and the bombs that were thrown onto Vietnam, much more than in the entire Second World War? Would you have said to a Vietnamese in 1973, no hope, or to a Cambodian at the end of the genocide, less than a decade later? No, you start every day, and there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do with joyful people, committed people, activists in civil society, in the corporate world, in the political world. There's too much to do, and there's not enough reason ever to give up that kind of hope.
That's a brilliant, brilliant thought, Edwin. Thank you for that. Looking back, can you pick one moment in your life that stands out as being an impossibly difficult challenge, when the odds really were stacked against you? And what, if anything, did you learn from it?
I think the impossibly difficult thing was deciding to speak out about my HIV, about having access to ARVs, to speak out against stigma, to speak out for testing and treatment access. And it seemed insuperable, it seemed unimaginable. What I learned from it was that you take risks, you've got to take calculated risks. I wouldn't say to a woman with an abusive male partner who infected her with HIV to go home, and I wouldn't say to her that telling the partner who infected her that she's got HIV is without risk. So you've got to be very grounded about those issues, but that sometimes in appropriate circumstances you've got to take a risk, and that the risk when you're doing the right thing is often rewarded.
Thank you so much, Edwin, for joining us on Against the Odds today, and for those really, truly inspiring stories.
Thank you, Jan. Lovely to be here with you.
Thank you so much for listening to Against the Odds. You can find more information and links in the podcast notes on unaids.org/podcasts. Do please share this episode, as it really helps us reach our growing audience. The podcast is presented by me, Jan Powell. The senior producer for UNAIDS is Charlotte Sector. Original music by Ken Nikravesh and Hugo Powell. Against the Odds is made by Powell Media for UNAIDS.